Ministers at War by Jonathan Schneer continued. Disc 3. Churchill offered Morrison the Ministry of Supply, and after some hesitation he accepted. But he had hoped for a more prominent position in a different coalition altogether. Meanwhile, Ernest Bevin, whom Churchill appointed Minister of Labour, and who would soon come to play an indispensable role, had despised and distrusted Herbert Morrison for a variety of reasons for many years. Someone once remarked in Bevin's hearing that Morrison, an inveterate intriguer, was his own worst enemy. "Not while I'm alive, he ain't," Bevin snapped in reply. This was the fractious collection of men Churchill had chosen to help him save the country. It would face many crises during the next 5 years, and none more grave than the one it faced at its inception. For even as the new cabinet ministers sniped at one another in Whitehall, the German juggernaut hurtled forward on the continent. British and French military experts misapprehended it entirely, just as Erich von Manstein had predicted would happen. They rushed their forces to meet the German thrust west and south through Belgium. They believed Hitler was following the strategy employed by the Kaiser in 1914, the Schlieffen Plan, as Manstein had foretold. How else and where else could Hitler engage his enemies? They thought the Maginot Line ensured the safety of central and southern France. Hitler could not blast his way through that daunting chain of fortresses, and he could not get around it, French generals believed, because the hilly, heavily wooded Ardennes region to its north was impenetrable. They were tragically mistaken. The main German attacking force, 10 panzer divisions, flashed not through Belgium. The forces Hitler sent there, although formidable, were secondary, but through the forests and the Ardennes hills under a canopy of trees, invisible to Allied reconnaissance aircraft. They emerged north of the Maginot Line at Sedan, the weakest point in the French defence system, where they routed the French Second Army. Then once the Germans were past Sedan and across the Meuse River, their tanks scythed through open French countryside, headed for the sea. They had no time even to collect prisoners, but contemptuously waved aside the French soldiers who had surrendered to them. Now the Allies, having dashed into Belgium to confront the enemy there, must also somehow turn to hold greater numbers on their southern flank. They could not cope with the enemy's swiftness, or with the audacity and originality of its war plan, or with the daring of its best generals. The Germans had encircled them, as Manstein had known would happen. This was the appalling avalanche descending at lightning speed on the heads of the new Prime Minister, insecurely installed, and his government of ill-assorted colleagues. They met at the outset in the cabinet room of 10 Downing Street in early September, when the Germans began bombing London. They would have to meet in an underground bunker. The 5 members of the War Cabinet, the 3 military service officers, the Minister of Information, the Chiefs of Staff, the head of the Foreign Office, and a secretary. Churchill sat at the centre of the table, Chamberlain to his immediate right, and then Attlee. Halifax faced Churchill across the table, with Greenwood to his immediate left. A pair of double columns stands at the entrance to the cabinet room at number 10, and there is a fireplace behind the Prime Minister's seat, with a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows facing it. 3 brass chandeliers hang from the ceiling high overhead. It is an imposing space, an imposing, if hardly collegial, team had gathered in it, and their world was collapsing about their ears. The news from the continent grew worse every time they met. On May 17, the Foreign Office man, Cadogan, recorded in his diary that Churchill sprang up and said he would go to France, and he did go there. 6 times during that short, awful period between his ascension to power and the French surrender on June 22. He tried desperately to stiffen his ally. Yet defeat continued to follow defeat, and retreat to follow retreat. A jointly planned counter-offensive proved chimerical, and it never was mounted. French and British defenders evacuated one French port after another, as the Germans, having reached the sea, now swept north irresistibly. Finally, the British Army, 250,000 men, and another 130,000 Allied soldiers, mainly French, had fallen back almost to the Belgian border at Dunkirk, the sole French harbour not yet under German control. There, separated by the Germans from the bulk of the defeated and demoralized French army, they stood at bay, backs to the sea, with enemy panzer divisions only 15 miles to the south and closing in, and the Luftwaffe waiting only for Goering's signal to bomb them to smithereens and to strafe the survivors. Evacuation would be difficult, if not impossible, everyone knew. Annihilation, therefore, seemed likely. Belgian resistance was about to collapse, so the Germans would attack from the north too. France teetered upon the verge of complete surrender. Few believed that Britain could continue the fight against rampant Germany without her allies, and with the cream of her army about to be blown to bits at Dunkirk. Unsurprisingly, then, at this desperate juncture, some began to whisper that the time had come to broach to Hitler the possibility of a compromise peace. Actually, the idea of a compromise peace had occurred to a number of more or less influential men long before the fourth week of May 1940. It grew from a variety of sources, chief among them the bundle of motives that went into Chamberlain's pre-war appeasement policies, most obviously visceral anti-communism and sympathy for German rage against the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles, coupled, in some quarters, with sympathy even for German anti-Semitism, although not for the totally brutal variety practiced later in the war. That bundle of motives remained strong among elements in the conservative rank and file, if not among the opposition parties or in the country as a whole. Other taproots were pacifism, which not all Britons thought inappropriate, even in present circumstances, communist opposition to a war in which they thought workers had no interest, since it pitted British imperialism against the German variety, and simple hard-headed calculation of Britain's chances in the current conflict. Thus, compromise with Hitler might appeal to elements in both Houses of Parliament, as well as to men and women belonging to all political parties. But it is fair to say that its most influential advocates belonged to the group still inclined to toast the king over the water. For a Conservative to broach a compromise peace during the fourth week of May 1940 was to resurrect the bitter argument between the Chamberlainites and Churchillians, before the latter had a chance to consolidate their position, and with Germany now at all their throats. Still, Lord Halifax broached it. He knew the advocates of an early peace already. As Foreign Secretary, he had been receiving their petitions, publications and letters since the war began. Occasionally he met them in person. He responded always with unfailing courtesy, if also with scepticism. The fundamental difficulty, he wrote in a typical response on March 12, 1940, to Lord Brocket, a far-right Conservative who wanted to contact Hitler to ascertain his peace terms, is the complete lack of confidence that the world generally feels in any promises emanating from the present German government. But with Germany triumphant everywhere, and with the added awful prospect of Italy jumping into the war to help her fascist ally deliver the coup de grace to prostrate France, without whom Britain's prospects seemed dim, Halifax reconsidered. He thought it might be possible to bargain with Mussolini, to keep him out of the conflict, and to turn conversations with him toward the wider problems of Europe, as he carefully informed the Italian ambassador, Count Giuseppe Bastianini, on Saturday, May 25. It was an indirect invitation to Italy to disclose what price the Allies must pay to keep her from entering the fray, and to ascertain the price Hitler would demand to end it. Was Halifax also thinking that in broaching these matters, he was preparing the way for his own elevation to the premiership? There is no evidence that this was his motivation, but perhaps the thought occurred. Over 3 days, May 26 to 28, 1940, the War Cabinet met an unprecedented 9 times. It was attempting simultaneously to cope with the emergency about to unfold at Dunkirk, the emergency of a pending Belgian surrender, which would leave the troops at Dunkirk even more dangerously exposed than previously, the emergency of French collapse, explained in person by French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who made a flying visit to London, the emergency of a likely German invasion of Britain, and above all, although at this point everything was connected, the recommendation made by Halifax and strongly supported by Reynaud, whose government had come independently to the same idea, that the best way to deal with all these emergencies at once was to bribe Mussolini to keep out, and through him to inquire what Hitler's peace terms would be. Whether to approach Mussolini or not truly represented the hinge of fate. Everything that followed would have been different if the Allies had sounded out the Italian leader, and if he then had approached Hitler, and if, as a result, Britain and Germany had ceased to fight in 1940 and begun discussing terms. On May 25, however, that was what Halifax urged. We had to face the fact, he warned, according to the War Cabinet minutes, that it was not so much now a question of imposing a complete defeat upon Germany, but of safeguarding the independence of our own empire. From this it followed, as he put it the next day, if we found that we could obtain terms which did not postulate the destruction of our independence, we should be foolish if we did not accept them. But Churchill realized immediately that Halifax risked too much. His retort was instantaneous. Peace and security might be achieved under a German domination of Europe. That we could never accept. Halifax's proposal would put Britain on the slippery slope, he charged later. If Britain engaged in talks now, she would never start fighting again. Moreover, there was no limit to the terms which Germany would impose upon us if she had her way. Thus the poles of debate. Halifax favoured another Munich-style agreement with the Nazis, hoping to save the British Empire at the expense of continental Europe, and perhaps some British colonies in Africa. Churchill passionately opposed one, convinced that it would not save, but rather doom his country, and thus all else. The 5 men of the War Cabinet debated the future of Britain and the world over the course of the next few days. They debated, too, their own future as a body. Churchill had risen to power as the champion of a tougher, more dynamic and thorough war effort. He had appointed a War Cabinet to help him organize and fight it. If the War Cabinet voted now to open talks with the enemy, it would be contradicting its own raison d'etre. It would render meaningless the appointment of its leader. It would be reversing the result of the long fight to oust Neville Chamberlain. But Churchill had no intention of opening talks. The rogue elephant preferred outright defeat to talking to the fascists now. He claimed at one point during the War Cabinet debate that nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. And at another, if the worst came to the worst, it would not be a bad thing for this country to go down fighting for the other countries that have been overcome by the Nazi tyranny. This was precisely the sort of language and sentiment that respectable Tories wanted the 2 wise old elephants to restrain. It must never be allowed to shape policy. Halifax wrote in his diary that, "It does drive me to despair when he works himself up into a passion of emotion, when he ought to make his brain think and reason." The Foreign Secretary believed it would be a very bad thing if Britain went down fighting, however gloriously. He feared, though he could not say it plainly, that Churchill, romantic and unrealistic, would lead the country to defeat, ushering in German occupation and utter ruin. Halifax would save Britain from that if he could. The Labour men staunchly supported Churchill. Attlee spoke little during the 9 meetings, but his interventions suggest that he never thought Britain should quit fighting. He warned 3 times that, With France nearly defeated, Hitler would be coming for Britain. During the first meeting of the second day, he spoke explicitly about the measures his country should take when the invaders arrived. We should have numerous highly mobile units, ready to act quickly on their own initiative. The division was too big. Spain and Finland had provided examples of what could be done against tanks by brave and determined men. The Labour Party leader had seen combat and had been wounded during World War I. He had risen to the rank of major, and he spoke with authority. He reproached and rejected Halifax indirectly. Then at the 4 p.m. meeting on May 28, he confronted the Foreign Secretary head-on. It was necessary to pay regard to public opinion in this country, the minutes say he warned. If the British people learned that their new government had opened discussions with the fascists now, they would sustain a severe shock. There was a grave danger that we should find it impossible to rally the morale of the people. Attlee meant that Britain would be finished if her people lost confidence in the government's determination, and that if it engaged in talks with Italy at this juncture, that was what would happen. At the War Cabinet meetings of May 26 through 28, Greenwood spoke more pointedly than Attlee, not in the memorable phrases of Winston Churchill, for Churchill was unique, but still with notable clarity and bluntness. Monsieur Reynaud was too much inclined to hawk round appeals, he charged at one point. This was an indirect quotation of the words Ernest Bevin had used in 1935 to destroy Labour's pacifist leader, George Lansbury. Greenwood was suggesting that the French Premier likewise wanted peace at any price. This, he said, referring to the idea of appealing to Mussolini as an intermediary, was another attempt to run out. When Attlee warned that Halifax risked undermining British morale, Greenwood backed him up. So far as the industrial centres of the country were concerned, they would regard anything like weakening on the part of the government as a disaster. He argued that France was finished anyway. The proposed talks would not save her, so there was no point entering into them. Like Churchill, he believed that Britain must not parley now, but fight, without France if necessary. The line of resistance was certainly a gamble, the minutes say that Greenwood asserted, but he did not feel that this was a time for ultimate capitulation. Halifax interjected heatedly. Nothing in my suggestion could even remotely be described as ultimate capitulation. Perhaps not, but Greenwood, Attlee, and Churchill agreed that it must lead there. That this exchange took place at all illustrates how profound the difference was between Halifax and his opponents, both in their understandings of the war and their views of what now was at stake. It is a measure of the weight of Halifax's influence at this point in the cabinet discussion that Churchill felt the need to strengthen his hand, despite the support offered him by the two Labour men. On the second day of the three-day debate, Monday, May 27, he brought in his recently appointed Secretary of State for Air, Archie Sinclair. Ostensibly, Sinclair attended because his Liberal Party must be represented in so important a discussion, even though it had only 25 seats in the House of Commons. But really, Churchill wanted another opponent of appeasement participating in the argument. Sinclair played up admirably, ably backing his old friend. Yet even this was not enough. The decisive boost to Churchill's confidence was provided, probably, by a gathering of the entire cabinet, excluding members of the War Cabinet, that took place between 6:15 and 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening, May 28. To this group of cabinet ministers, Churchill explained the situation without any sugarcoating. British troops were cut off on the continent and surrounded. France was on the verge of defeat, and German invasion of England seemed likely. It would be said that what was now happening in northern France would be the greatest British military defeat for many centuries, but he expressed an indomitable determination to keep on fighting. Let the Germans come. We should mine all round our coast. Our navy was immensely strong. Our air defences were much more easily organised from this island than across the Channel. Our supplies of food, oil, etc. were ample. We had good troops in this island. Others were on the way by sea. And as to aircraft, we were now more than making good our current losses, and the Germans were not. Churchill made another argument, perhaps more to the point, given the War Cabinet discussions. It was idle to think that, if we tried to make peace now, we should get better terms from Germany than if we went on and fought it out. The Germans would demand our fleet. That would be called disarmament, our naval bases, and much else. We should become a slave state. The Labour man Hugh Dalton, an old Etonian and Cambridge graduate whom Churchill had appointed Minister of Economic Warfare, listened and understood pretty well what the Prime Minister had not said, as well as what he had. It is quite clear that whereas the old umbrella, Chamberlain, wanted to run very early, Winston's bias is all the other way, he wrote afterward in his diary. Dalton thought the Prime Minister quite magnificent. He scribbled in the margins of his diary a direct quotation from Churchill's extemporaneous remarks. Britain would never quit. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. From the assemblage of Cabinet Ministers, Conservative, Liberal and Labour alike, came not a single word of dissent, not one qualifying sentiment. Rather, Churchill wrote that when he had finished speaking, quite a number seemed to jump up from the table and come running to my chair, shouting and patting me on the back. Dalton was one of those to make so uncharacteristic a gesture from a member of Britain's tightly buttoned, undemonstrative ruling class. But Dalton wrote in his diary that night of Winston Churchill, "He is a darling." The War Cabinet reconvened immediately after this extraordinary meeting. Churchill explained to its 4 members what he had just said, and to whom, and what had been the reaction, and also his great satisfaction at his reception. Halifax must have understood at this moment that there would be no British approach to Mussolini. Yet there remained another wise old elephant in the room, Neville Chamberlain, and everything might have been different even now if he had come out strongly in support of the Foreign Minister. Instead, he waffled. His first reaction to Halifax's proposal was positive. He thought it could keep Italy out of the war and France in, and therefore that it was worth pursuing. By the second day, however, he had concluded that France was all but out of the war already, and that therefore the approach to Signor Mussolini would serve no useful purpose. He agreed with a statement Churchill made during the 3-day argument. Britain would have a stronger bargaining position after repulsing the imminent German attack than it did now, when Germany appeared and felt triumphant on all fronts. But where Churchill hoped that repelling an invasion would lead to ultimate victory in some presently unforeseeable way, Chamberlain merely thought it could lead to talks with the enemy on a more equal footing, and then to a compromise peace. As he put it on the 3rd day of debate, if we could hold out, we should be able to obtain terms which would not affect our independence. This put him at odds with Halifax, but not over fundamentals. While an approach to Italy was useless at the present time, it might be that we should take a different view in a short time, possibly even a week hence. In short, Chamberlain objected to the timing of Halifax's proposal, not to its ultimate aim. Dalton had been wrong that the old umbrella wanted to run. He wanted to fight, but only for the time being. Like Halifax, Chamberlain hoped for a compromise peace. He just did not believe Britain could get an acceptable one yet. If Chamberlain had supported the Foreign Secretary outright, it is hard to see how Churchill, unpopular as he was with the Tory rank and file, could have survived. He would have lost the Conservative element in his War Cabinet. If Chamberlain and Halifax had resigned on this issue, and at one point Halifax suggested that he might, then Churchill could not have continued as Prime Minister. What would have happened next is anybody's guess. Certainly nothing good. Chamberlain's assessment of the position in late May 1940 may have been more realistic than Churchill's. He knew that Britain alone could never defeat Germany. So did Halifax. Possibly Churchill knew it too. He may already have been pinning hopes on American entry into the war. But he understood a greater truth, one that his two Conservative colleagues failed to grasp. You could never count upon a deal with Adolf Hitler, and it was indeed better to go on fighting him, even to the death if necessary, than to try to negotiate one. Precisely because he was a rogue elephant who did not fear, but rather understood war and gloried in battle, Winston Churchill comprehended more deeply than the wise old elephants did. Attlee and Greenwood understood too, because, as Labour men who had seen their German colleagues persecuted, tormented and murdered by the Nazis, they had long known it was impossible to bargain with Hitler. Thus the War Cabinet, led by Winston Churchill, passed its first great test, but only by the skin of its teeth. And although historians stress the improving relations between the Prime Minister and his Conservative colleagues in the War Cabinet at this point, in fact Churchill must have continued to harbour doubts, at least about his Foreign Secretary. Unexpected developments would allow him to act upon them before the year was out. Chapter 4. The Months of Greatest Crisis. During the summer of 1940, Churchill's War Cabinet numbered 5, including himself. Over the course of the war he occasionally shuffled its membership, but no more than 8 men ever served in it at once, and a corps of 4 or 5 served nearly from beginning to end, although only Clement Attlee served for the complete period. At the beginning, none of the War Cabinet members except for Halifax held departmental responsibilities, but this arrangement, which was meant to facilitate concentration on the conflict, lapsed as the war ground on, to the consternation of some government critics, as will become apparent. Because Britain's survival depended upon national unity and solidarity, the War Cabinet had to reflect the most important currents moving the country. Churchill understood this and shaped the body accordingly. He maintained a balance between left and right, Labour and Conservative. Obviously, the spectrum of opinion within the larger cabinet, and within the government as a whole, which contained dozens of senior and junior ministers, ranged even more broadly. At its best, Churchill's coalition government brought together exceedingly right-wing Tories and strongly left-wing socialists, who united in a common purpose. The War Cabinet functioned as Britain's supreme authority. It dealt, by design, only with the most important topics of the day, the major foreign, domestic and imperial issues raised by the war. A netherworld of carefully structured committees, capped by the Defence Committee led by Churchill, and the Lord President's Committee, led first by Chamberlain, but for most of the war by Sir John Anderson, and then by Attlee, ensured that lesser subjects never reached the War Cabinet, and that those which did had been carefully considered already, and side issues dealt with. At first, the War Cabinet met daily, but gradually its schedule grew more erratic. At moments of crisis, it met as often as necessary. It almost always met at least 3 times per week, at noon on Wednesdays and Thursdays, when only War Cabinet ministers attended, although other ministers might be invited for particular items, and at 5:30 p.m. on Mondays for the Monday Parade, when constant attenders, such as the Minister for Air, Archie Sinclair, would be present, along with the Chiefs of Staff, who would provide military briefings, and other ministers whose particular expertise was relevant that day. Sometimes important representatives of the Dominions who happened to be in London would attend the Monday meetings as well. Churchill modelled his War Cabinet on David Lloyd George's War Cabinet of World War I, but with an important difference. Churchill served not only as Prime Minister, but also as Minister of Defence, and as such, as Chairman of the Defence Committee. In this way he maintained control over the War Departments, Army, Air Force and Navy, the Chiefs of Staff, COS, and military affairs more generally in a manner that Lloyd George never had. Moreover, unlike Lloyd George, Churchill never hesitated to contradict his military advisers, when, for example, a member of the COS was briefing the War Cabinet. But although Winston Churchill knew a lot about war, his generals knew more, and the problem was to get him to see that. He bubbled over with ideas, and once he fixed on one, he usually held to it stubbornly, even if it was no good. The diaries of General Alan Brooke, later Field Marshal and 1st Viscount Alan Brooke, whom Churchill appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff, CIGS, in December 1941, are littered with references to his master's frightful impatience, to his behaving like a spoilt child when contradicted, and so on. In Brooke, however, Churchill faced a man as iron-willed as himself, equally adroit and quick-witted, and moreover impossible to intimidate. General Brooke supported Churchill's plans when he thought they were good, acquiesced in the bad ones when he had to, or managed to improve them, and defied his chief when he thought it absolutely necessary. This did not ensure perfection, but rather something equally rare at this level, full and frank discussions. It makes an extraordinary story. Surely Hitler's generals did not enjoy similar license. Until the Germans started bombing London on a massive scale in September 1940, the War Cabinet met at 10 Downing Street. Thereafter, it began to meet in a suite of underground rooms in the basement of the new government offices at the corner of Horse Guards Road and King Charles Street, just across from St. James's Park. The authorities had chosen the suite as a suitable temporary emergency government centre in the spring of 1938, as war loomed. They arranged for it to be fortified and outfitted, including a cabinet room. When Churchill visited shortly after becoming Prime Minister, he said, "This is the room from which I'll direct the war." Today, the site is a museum called the Cabinet War Rooms. Tourists wander through and gain some notion of their claustrophobic atmosphere, for the ceilings are not high. Many of the rooms are quite small, and of course there are no windows. Churchill broadcast some of his most famous speeches from one of those tiny, windowless rooms. Another room, larger, has a wall lined with a great map charting Allied progress in the war, or lack of it. During the period of the London Blitz, and then during 1944 to 1945, when Hitler launched the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets, some War Cabinet ministers and important military personnel not only worked, but also slept there, in monk-like cells. They could dine there too. Churchill, however, usually returned to dine and sleep in a specially reinforced annex at 10 Downing Street, and Halifax continued to live at the Dorchester Hotel, as he had been doing ever since a German bomb demolished his house in Eaton Square. When the bombers came, he would take refuge with the other guests in the hotel's cellar. Almost everyone in the War Cabinet stayed close by the Prime Minister's residence. When he finally stepped down from the top position, Chamberlain moved just across from number 10 to number 11 Downing Street, where he lived until he was overcome by the illness that would kill him, and retreated to Highfield Park, his country house in Heckfield, Hampshire. Attlee, who owned a large house in Stanford, in outer northwest London, usually spent the night at number 11. Anthony Eden often stayed at the War Office, or later in rooms at the Foreign Office. Lord Beaverbrook stayed for a time at his own grand residence, Stornoway House at Cleveland Row, near the end of Pall Mall, a 10-minute walk away, and when the Germans bombed it, at the offices of one of his newspapers, the Evening Standard, just off Fleet Street. Ernest Bevin kept a flat slightly farther afield, at South Molton Street in Mayfair. Two Labour men who were to play important roles likewise arranged for close quarters. Herbert Morrison, with a home in south-east London, generally slept in the basement of the Home Office or at a nearby hotel. and Stafford Cripps bought a tiny flat in Whitehall Court between the War Office and Victoria Embankment. This proximity explains why it was possible for Churchill to summon his war ministers for consultations at a moment's notice, even late at night. The War Cabinet ministers worked nearly cheek by jowl as well. The Admiralty and the War Office faced each other across Whitehall, the broad boulevard that connects Trafalgar Square to Parliament Square. Farther down Whitehall, Downing Street runs off at a right angle, with number 10 on one side and the Foreign Office on the other. Behind the Foreign Office runs King Charles Street, and across this street lie the Treasury and new government offices, beneath which were the Cabinet war rooms. The Houses of Parliament sit only a little farther on down Whitehall. It was practically a sealed workspace, although with German bombs periodically ripping through. One understands why Churchill relished getting off to Chequers, the country residence of British Prime Ministers on weekends, and Eden to a country house in Sussex called Binderton, and Beaverbrook to his grand country house Cherkley Court near Leatherhead in Surrey. No doubt the others too sought country respites during weekends. Once the War Cabinet ruled out talks with Mussolini that might have led to talks with Hitler, Britain had to confront the possibility of German invasion, a frightening prospect, as Britain had scarcely any trained, well-equipped troops at home. Most British soldiers remained in France. The vast majority squeezed into Dunkirk, just south of the Belgian border, where about 250,000 of them and about half that number of Allied troops faced millions of well-armed, well-led, highly motivated Germans closing in from almost every side. Britain had to have those soldiers home, facing the enemy when the time came. Could she mobilize the armada necessary to transport them from France? Could the RAF protect them from the Luftwaffe when the Tommies stood, as they would have to, with water up to their waists, in queues snaking from the beaches into the sea, waiting to board the ships that would take them back to England? Failure was unthinkable, not merely for the soldiers, but also for Britain's chances in the war. Yet failure seemed highly likely, because at this stage the Germans held all the advantages. The story of how Britain succeeded against all odds in saving the men is well known. She put together a flotilla that included, aside from vessels of the Royal Navy, fishing boats, butterfly boats, tugboats, yachts, pleasure steamers, Thames lifeboats, shrimping boilies, even a large garbage scow called a sludge hopper. These and others helped, in the face of withering incoming fire, to ferry the men out to the transport ships waiting to take them back to England. And the RAF did prevent the Luftwaffe from gaining control of the airspace above Dunkirk. Otherwise, the escape that was taking place below could not have occurred at all. The rescue mission extended over the course of an excruciatingly dramatic week, May 27 to June 4, of which the first 4 days were most important. The government called the desperate undertaking Operation Dynamo, and those in the War Cabinet, and the few others attending its meetings who knew what was going on, were deeply pessimistic about it at first. Position of British Expeditionary Force quite awful, and I can see no hope for more than a tiny fraction of them now that Belgium has capitulated. The Foreign Office Mandarin Alex Cadogan wrote in his diary at the end of the day the evacuation began, May 27. Prospects of BEF look blacker than ever, he wrote gloomily on May 28. 24 hours later he thought the situation had improved, but still that it was ultimately hopeless. We have got off 40,000 men, and are taking them, at present, at a rate of 2,000 an hour. But the end will be awful. The Royal Navy and the RAF strained to quicken the process. Amazingly, and contrary to all predictions, they managed it. On Saturday, June 1, Cadogan recorded exultantly, "Evacuation marvellous. We have got off 224,000, including about 34,000 Allies. In the end, they got off approximately 225,000 British soldiers and about 111,000 Allies, many of them Frenchmen, who returned immediately to their native land in the forlorn hope of helping to stem the German tide there. Britons at the time, and many others since, have called Operation Dynamo a near miracle, although Churchill admitted that wars could not be won by evacuations, however miraculous. Britain had just evacuated the finally successful occupied Narvik in Norway. In fact, many British and Allied soldiers thought the whole thing a chaotic affair on their side, one they had been lucky to survive. They knew that, actually, despite the extraordinary variety of crafts sent over from England, there had been an insufficient number to ferry all of them from shore to the big ships taking them home, and that they had needlessly lost men as a result, and that there had been too few officers to organize them while they waited on the beaches, which also led to losses, and that they had left behind nearly all their equipment: tanks, guns, trucks, tractors, ammunition. Revealingly, British authorities forbade the returning soldiers to talk publicly about what had happened, for fear of undermining morale on the home front. Most German officers thought the evacuation hardly mattered. They deemed Britain's ignominious retreat from the mainland to be the capstone of their conquest of Europe. Now the island nation would either sue for peace or face the consequences. Hitler did not worry much about the 250,000 men who had gotten away, although of course he was displeased with Hermann Göring for letting them do so. But he focused instead upon the many million more French and Allied soldiers in the process of surrendering to his armies, and then upon the treaty he would force their leaders to sign on June 22. Knowing nothing of the battle so recently fought in the War Cabinet, he appears to have thought it only a matter of time before Britain, too, approached him for peace terms. He would be generous, according to his lights, so long as Britain recognized his conquests thus far. But Churchill had prevailed in the vital debate in the War Cabinet, and so Britain would not recognize Hitler's conquest of Europe. On the night of June 16, the Prime Minister appeared before Parliament to sound a warning. "The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us," he prophesied. "Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island, or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Commonwealth and Empire lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" The War Cabinet agreed. So did most of the country. Among the populace, a grim determination was taking hold. Churchill gave it voice. They would give it flesh, and blood, and sweat, toil, and tears. Those today who emphasize the strength of the Royal Navy and of the RAF, and who therefore discount the likelihood of German invasion, may have the kernel of the military situation, but not of the psychological one. The British people readied themselves. Their leaders did too, writing to each other, and in their diaries, that the Germans would be coming soon. They said the same in cabinet meetings and in public. From mid-June until at least mid-September 1940, a pending German invasion remained their primary preoccupation and worry. The nearness of danger led British officials to scout wild possibilities, to imagine fantastic scenarios, and to arrive at hasty conclusions. On June 30, soon after the French surrender, Churchill received a suggestion. If local authorities were instructed to dig trenches across all flat fields more than 400 yards long, it should be possible to reduce the danger from airborne troops to negligible proportions. On this missive, the Prime Minister scrawled, "Let this be done today." Then more sober heads prevailed. The commander of the Home Forces calculated that the work would take 200,000 men, a year to complete. The Minister of Agriculture, Lord Moyne, voiced his complaints about the great damage being done unnecessarily to agriculture throughout the country. Moreover, the trenches would deny not only German, but also British pilots any place for emergency landings. On top of that, Britain's farmers would be furious. Some trenches were dug, but by midsummer the project had ground to a halt. Suppose, however, the Germans made landfall not from the sky, but from the sea, and that they then advanced inland. What could stop them? Churchill wrote to Eden at the War Office about a mortar, which is capable of throwing an ordinary bottle, for example a beer bottle, 150 yards or more. These bottles could be filled with high explosive. He had another idea. The use of ordinary commercial vans or caravans, of which there are many thousands in the country, as mobile pillboxes. They could be lined with bulletproof plate, roughly bolted together, and provided with proper slots, etc., for firing. It does not bear thinking on. Dad's army, hurling beer bottles at advancing German panzer divisions, and facing off with them in converted vans. Churchill's primary military assistant and liaison with the COS Committee, General Hastings Lionel Pug Ismay, thought that when the invaders came, British soldiers ought to wear German uniforms to confuse them. It would have confused Britons too. Churchill's son-in-law, the Conservative MP Duncan Sandys, recently back in Britain from active service in Norway, actually inquired what would happen if the Germans, when they got to Britain, let loose prisoners, lunatics and wild animals. The Home Defence Executive took this query seriously enough to respond. The prisons point is covered. As far as mental patients are concerned, the difficulties of trying to forestall the Germans' ruse would appear greater than those of coping with the ruse itself. Nobody seems to have given specific consideration to the question of wild animals. Churchill received an avalanche of advice on how to resist invasion. A Conservative MP who had recently returned from France reported that hordes of refugees fleeing before the German advance contributed largely to her downfall. He advised, therefore, that orders be issued, tonight, not tomorrow or the day after, that in the event of a landing by air or sea, all non-combatants, except those engaged on the spot in essential services necessary for defence, should remain in their houses or shelters and should, in advance, provide themselves with a week's food. Better have martial law at once, another Conservative advised the Prime Minister. Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, representing the views of the Watching Committee, which had played so important a role in the downfall of Chamberlain and was still meeting, called for the establishment of a Committee of Public Safety, an odd term for a British Conservative to borrow from the Jacobins of revolutionary France, that would be empowered to take dictatorial measures. The people should be made under direct orders to take part in the work of defence. From the left, too, came calls for a people's war, in which all Britons would participate in one way or another. In fact, the national emergency was galvanising the British left. Its belief in a government with compulsory powers to direct things for the common good finally resonated among all classes. The Socialists in Churchill's War Cabinet would give increasing voice to this belief as the war ground on. Some of Churchill's correspondents claimed expert knowledge on military matters. One predicted a German landing on the east coast, another on the southwest coast, a third that the Germans would not try to land at all to begin with, but focus instead upon the destruction of the fleet. To such well-meaning advice, Churchill usually responded promptly, politely, and, if necessary, vaguely. To a Labour MP who wrote seeking assurance that London would never be declared a free city as Paris had been, he wrote, "You may rest assured that we should fight every street of London and its suburbs. It would devour an invading army. We hope, however, to drown the bulk of them in the salt sea." To an old appeaser who still thought compromise with Hitler was possible, he replied much more sharply, "I am ashamed of you for writing such a letter. I return it to you, to burn and forget." But he retained a copy in his files. The Prime Minister's enthusiasm for unorthodox, even harebrained schemes for the national defence may have dismayed his colleagues, but his determination to fight on, whatever the odds, undoubtedly inspired them. And of course the War Cabinet under his leadership proved capable of realistic assessment, hard-headed planning, and ruthless action, or else it would never have survived. It rejected the wild schemes, even when they came from Churchill, but it did not reject unorthodoxy out of hand. Any measure that strengthened the country's chances must be considered, no matter how far-reaching, even if it interfered with property rights or cherished liberties, and even if it upset long-established hierarchies. For his part, Churchill would do whatever he thought necessary to save the country. Pressure was coming from both left and right for the government to assume sweeping powers. The Prime Minister did not hesitate. On May 22, he deputed Attlee to broadcast on the BBC. "Today, on your behalf, Parliament has given to the government full power to control all persons and property. There is no distinction between rich and poor, between worker and employer, between man and woman. The government now has the right to call upon any citizen to do the work that is most immediately required in the national interest. It has power to control any business, factory, mine, shop, or bank, and order it to be carried on in the way desired. It can take property of every kind. The direction of persons to perform services will be under the Minister of Labour, Ernest Bevin." Thus the trade union titan advanced toward the centre of the stage. Measures that respectable Tories might consider heretical did not frighten Ernest Bevin, and he positively enjoyed flattening the faint hearts among them who regarded his policies with apprehension. Born into poverty in 1881, as a young man, Ernest Bevin had worked as a carter in the port of Bristol. There, eventually, he joined the Old Dockers Union. Untutored but formidable both intellectually and physically, he possessed a massive head and torso. Someone once compared his hands to bunches of bananas. He ascended the union ladder rapidly, gaining, pre-1914, a local and then, post-1918, a national reputation not merely as a powerful advocate for the men, but also as a commanding figure on the anti-communist trade union left. A sort of human bulldozer, in 1922 he brushed aside and pensioned off the union's aging founder and leader, Ben Tillett, to preside over the establishment of, and to become chief of, a new body into which the Old Dockers Union was merged, the Transport and General Workers Union. By the late 1930s, this had become the largest labour union in Europe. He sought no political office. The T&G was his life. During the interwar period, including even during the Depression, he built it and strengthened it, and successfully defended it against all comers, whether from the right or the left. Churchill recognized Bevin's extraordinary capacities and would come to depend upon them. But it was Bevin's position as the country's outstanding trade unionist that made him indispensable. He dominated the T&G, and he played a leading role in the umbrella organization of which it was the largest affiliate, the Trade Union Congress, TUC, which he had led as president in 1937. This body represented nearly 5 million workers. Britain's survival now depended on their willingness to labour without stinting, and to suffer. Neville Chamberlain could never have mobilised them. They hated him and what they thought he stood for. But Winston Churchill could, if he had Ernest Bevin standing by his side. Bevin was reluctant to stand there at first. He remembered Churchill's strident anti-unionism during the general strike of 1926, and viewed him as an enemy of British workers. And Bevin had no ambition to play a role at Westminster. Labour people argued with him for 15 hours at Bournemouth, trying to persuade him to take the job, remembered one who had attended the party's annual conference in early May, just as the Germans had launched their attack. And then, when he finally agreed to serve in the cabinet, he initially hoped to do so without becoming a member of Parliament. Eventually, however, he accepted Churchill's invitation and the Labour Party's offer of a safe seat in the House of Commons, not merely for the obvious patriotic reasons, but also because, as he put it to a special conference of trade union leaders shortly after his appointment, if our movement and our class rise with all their energy now and save the people of this country from disaster, the country will always turn with confidence to the people who saved them. And he knew what the people who saved the country would demand after the war had been won. Already the demand was growing in volume and assurance throughout the nation. It was what he wanted too. A new motive for industry, for life, as he explained to another audience. The whole of your economy, finance, organization, science, everything, directed to give social security to the community as a whole. So Bevan stood with Churchill after all. Upon his appointment, he reckoned Britain's chances of survival at about 2.5%. I was faced with an enemy with 200 million, that is to say, most of Europe's working class, at his disposal, he recalled, and I had to weigh up what it was possible to put against that. He had to act quickly, and he did. I came into office at 2:30 on the afternoon of Tuesday, and on Wednesday at 11 o'clock I produced at least the outline of the basis of my scheme. Then at 3 o'clock the staff gathered round me and examined it all in its details, and by Friday night we had circulated it to the rest of the departments. He was exaggerating, of course. The scheme did not originate with him. He adapted earlier versions. But modesty never was his strong suit. Organization was. In May 1940, the British adult population totaled about 33 million, not including men soon to be drafted into the military. Bevan's job was to coordinate and to stimulate production on the home front in order to match or beat enemy output. But the workforce was hemorrhaging men, for the military had to have them. Bevan had to square this circle. His principles made it harder. He had the power to do so, but he did not relish dictating to workers. As their long-time advocate, he favored voluntary, not forced labor, not only as a principle, but because he thought it more effective in the long run. Moreover, he wanted to maintain trade union practices wherever possible. Bevan recalled, "You had to work out a very careful timetable to see to it that you did not call your men up too quick. Hold them in the factories and the workshops as long as you could. When you see the equipment coming out, then put them in the services in time to get the preliminary training so no time should be wasted." Quickly he realized that Britain's women must step forward, if possible, of their own free will, and not as a result of conscription. But he had to conscript them in the end, to replace the men in shops, mines, mills, factories, and on the land. "I had a headache over that for several weeks," Bevan would say later about conscripting female labor. "I was not so much frightened of the women as I wondered what the old man would say." He had to initiate training schemes. He had to prioritize, and then on the basis of priorities, he had to move both men and women into whatever industry needed them, wherever it was, and he had to keep their goodwill. Without that, he knew there would be no increase in production, and Britain would lose the war. "I tried to the best of my ability to build up the clubs, welfare, travelling arrangements, to harness the whole of the churches and all kinds of institutions, trade unions, cooperative societies, and tried to make their life as congenial as I could under war conditions." He had accepted a nearly impossible and yet crucial job, and he could not satisfy everyone. Critics on the right thought he favoured the workers and their unions. Critics on the left thought he tried for too long to maintain the voluntary principle. They wanted government direction for the common good now. Bevan adapted his plans when necessary and ploughed forward. In the cabinet, and then in the war cabinet, to which Churchill promoted him in October 1940, he overshadowed the self-effacing Attlee and the unimperative Greenwood among the Labour contingent. Even though he never aspired to replace them as party leaders, he represented Wandsworth Central now, but he was never a House of Commons man. For that matter, he overshadowed not merely his Labour colleagues, but most Conservatives too. One Conservative colleague, however, he did not overshadow. Bevan knew that the Germans could not invade unless they first gained mastery of the skies above the British coastline. And if Britain kept up aeroplane production, then the RAF probably could keep the Germans away. Bevan thought it would be his job to allocate and direct the labourers building and repairing aeroplanes. For that, however, Churchill turned to his old friend, Lord Beaverbrook, proprietor of the Daily Express, the Sunday Express, the London Evening Standard, and 2 newspapers in Scotland, appointing him chief of the recently created Ministry of Aircraft Production, MAP, on May 14, and promoting him to the War Cabinet on August 2, even before he brought in Bevan. Beaverbrook did not want the Labour Minister encroaching on his turf. He intended to control manpower where the aircraft industry was concerned. Bevan had to accept it, but he did not like it. Relations between the two men never prospered. To some, Beaverbrook seemed an unlikely appointment. During the run-up to World War II, he had supported Chamberlain and opposed Churchill. He believed in Britain's splendid isolation. He disliked Chamberlain's grudging guarantee of Poland after the betrayal of Czechoslovakia at Munich in October 1938, because he did not believe his country could or would effectively defend Poland from Germany. Events proved him right. Britain and France did little for Poland when Germany attacked her. From the beginning of hostilities, right up until April 1940, Beaverbrook favoured arranging a compromise peace with Germany. When Hitler shattered the phony war by striking westward, however, the press lord realised that his country stood on the edge of a frightful abyss. Britain must now fight for her life. For that, she needed a prime minister who understood war. Like many others, Beaverbrook turned away from Neville Chamberlain in May 1940. The press lord had no experience of executive power in government, and not much of the House of Commons when Churchill called. He had served as an MP only from 1910 to 1916, and then took a peerage in order to accommodate Lloyd George, whose rise to power in the middle year of World War I he facilitated by helping him establish lines of communication with Andrew Bonar Law, leader of the Conservative Party. The Canadian-born Beaverbrook, who was friendly with both men, not only brought the two together, but also put his country house at their disposal. During the interwar era, Beaverbrook did not play a prominent role in the House of Lords, but rather built his great press empire. He knew everybody. Still, the king objected when Churchill proposed appointing him head of the MAP on May 14, 1940. George VI claimed that the Canadians do not appreciate him. More likely, the king worried about Beaverbrook's inexperience of government office. Or perhaps Beaverbrook seemed to him the kind of dissolute, brash and extravagant gangster that almost everyone among the respectable tendency of Tories hated and feared. The fact that Beaverbrook had supported the appeasers so recently had nothing to do with it. George VI had supported the appeasers too. Churchill, however, insisted. He had known Lord Beaverbrook for 3 decades, and he felt comfortable with him, although their friendship had waxed and waned. It had waned most recently in April 1938, when Beaverbrook had terminated Churchill's regular column in the Evening Standard for attacking Chamberlain and appeasement. During the waxing phases, however, the two had gossiped and schemed, drank, smoked cigars and gambled at cards, to the dismay of Mrs. Churchill, who never liked or trusted the Canadian. FDR's roving ambassador, Averell Harriman, once observed that Beaverbrook understood that Churchill's card sense was almost non-existent. But Beaverbrook also understood that Churchill admired him because he could do things a Prime Minister could not, and that winning at cards was one of them. The press lord never let his friend off easy. In May 1943, when he and Churchill and Harriman crossed the Atlantic on the Queen Mary, Harriman and Beaverbrook made a pact not to take advantage of Churchill when they sat at the card table. Beaverbrook promptly broke the pact in order to maintain the image Churchill had of him. Harriman wrote, "Winning from the PM at poker is an essential part of their relationship." Churchill had no long history with any of his other associates. and all his early close friends in the political world had died. Among his cabinet colleagues, only Beaverbrook had served with him in Lloyd George's government as Minister of Information during World War I. When Churchill appointed Beaverbrook, he chose to ignore their recent disagreement about appeasement, but to remember their long-standing connection, and to look to him for friendship as well as for assistance. In May 1940, in his hour of greatest need, he also made him his confidant. The day Churchill became Prime Minister, the two lunched together and dined together. The next day, they lunched together again. The day after that, they conferred all afternoon, and Beaverbrook stayed for dinner. Beaverbrook was helping Churchill to choose his first government. At the moment of supreme crisis, with France on the verge of collapse, Churchill travelled to Tours on June 13 for what proved to be his final wartime meeting with French President Paul Reynaud. He brought Beaverbrook with him. "In trouble, he is always buoyant," Churchill would write later. His old friend played a crucial role. The British contingent of 8 arrived to dismal weather, a dismal scene, dismal greeting and lunch, and then dismal news. Unless America immediately entered the war, France would bow out. Churchill and his colleagues withdrew to the back garden to discuss the situation. At first, pacing between puddles and under dripping branches, they dithered. But suddenly Beaverbrook spoke. General Sir Edward Spears, Churchill's liaison officer with the French government, remembered. His dynamism was immediately felt. "There is nothing to do but to repeat what you have already said, Winston. Telegraph to Roosevelt and await the answer. Tell Reynaud that we have nothing to say or discuss until Roosevelt's answer is received. Don't commit yourself to anything. We shall gain a little time and see how these Frenchmen sort themselves out. We are doing no good here. In fact, listening to these declarations of Reynaud's only does harm. Let's get along home." Churchill readily accepted Beaverbrook's practical, insightful advice. This moment in the muddy garden behind the prefecture office in Tours distills another aspect of their relationship. Churchill may have been the patron, but he relied upon the recipient of his patronage for counsel. Urgency was in his temperament, wrote A.J.P. Taylor, the great historian, who knew Beaverbrook personally and loved him. Beaverbrook despised committee work, hidebound tradition, red tape, and above all, the time that he judged to be wasting talking with ignoramuses. One morning, a couple of months into his tenure in office, a newspaperman arrived by invitation to interview him just as a senior official from the Air Ministry was leaving. "It is the curse of my life," Beaverbrook confided to the journalist as soon as the official had departed, "having to talk to these air marshals for an hour or 2 hours every morning. I can't bear having to sit down and listen to them talking." He wanted action, not palaver. He put 3 signs above his desk that encapsulated his outlook. They read, "Committees take the punch out of war. Organization is the enemy of improvisation. And all things in war are simple, but the simple is always difficult." During the summer of 1940, a sense of urgency was what Britain needed. Her survival depended first of all upon increased and faster production of aircraft, mainly fighters to defend British airspace, not bombers, although the air marshals favoured the latter, believing, incorrectly, that British capacity to bomb German cities would deter the Germans from bombing Britain. Beaverbrook faced the issue as Churchill hoped he would, squarely, imaginatively, practically and effectively, focused always upon the immediate task at hand, which to him meant the production of fighter aeroplanes. It occurred to him that he could cannibalize parts from 3 or 4 downed aircraft, including enemy aircraft, to make one serviceable machine. The number of repairs swiftly mounted. Patched-up fighters would play a crucial role in the Battle of Britain. By its end, England had as many cannibalized fighters as fighters built from scratch. Beaverbrook smashed all the old bottlenecks and obstacles to rapid production. For example, he directed his agents to take spare parts from the airfields when needed, much to the dismay of the Air Ministry, which was hoarding them. Beaverbrook answered, "Better a stringency in spares and a bountiful supply of aircraft than a surplus of spares and a shortage of aircraft." So effective was he during his period of dictatorship, for that is what it was, over the MAP, that the problem became not to find sufficient fighters to defend Britain, but to train sufficient pilots to fly them. He drove his ministry, and all the men who worked directly or even indirectly for it, to the edge of endurance, and sometimes over it. Upon appointment, he insisted that production in aircraft factories be carried on night and day, 7 days a week, for the next month. Then he extended this exhausting schedule indefinitely. He would telephone subordinates at midnight, and in the small hours of the morning to demand reports, or to exhort them to additional effort. There is a story, apparently not apocryphal, about a Nottingham lace-maker whose 6-man shop had been converted to produce spare parts for aircraft. His wife roused him at 2 o'clock one morning. Lord Beaverbrook was on the line from London to congratulate him on his rate of production. But he could also rant on the telephone, and many of his subordinates came to dread it when he rang. One, who was on a tour of inspection, found his aeroplane had been grounded. Enemy aircraft were about to bomb the area. "Oh my God, is that all?" the man cried in relief. "I thought it was a telephone call from Lord Beaverbrook." The figures tell the tale of Beaverbrook's success. Manufacture of all types of aircraft doubled between February and September 1940, and for fighter planes it quadrupled. The total output of aircraft for 1940 was twice that of Germany's. It is true that production had begun to rise under the previous minister, Kingsley Wood, so Beaverbrook should not get all the credit. But Wood did not have to deal with German bombing when he was chief of MAP, as Beaverbrook did. Under Beaverbrook, production made good all losses to the German attackers, and more. The figures do not tell how difficult many of his colleagues found this mercurial high-octane personality. They objected not only to his temperament. Sometimes his judgment failed, and they knew it. For example, 12-hour days and 7-day work weeks might produce good results over the short term. Over the long term, they could not be sustained. Beaverbrook insisted that they should be continued, however. At cabinet meetings he rowed with the chief of the despised air marshals, Archie Sinclair, the Minister for Air. Sinclair agreed with his generals that Britain needed bombers, not fighters, and that certain aeroplanes should be sent to Canada or South Africa, where pilots could train in them. Beaverbrook argued against both ideas, and because he determined how many aircraft were built, where they were built, and what type were built, he always won. During his stint at the MAP, relations with the Air Ministry sank to an all-time low. Beaverbrook's relations with Bevan began low and continued to drop. The great trade union leader was suspicious of the owner of the conservative imperialist Express newspapers even before Beaverbrook entered the government. Now on top of that, he resented Beaverbrook's control of manpower in the realm of aircraft production and repair. Moreover, he could never accept the labour speed-up, the end to trade union practices, and the ruthless requisitioning of men that Beaverbrook demanded. Perforce the two men had to sit at the same table and to agree to government policies if the War Cabinet was to function. Beaverbrook developed a pronounced respect for his great antagonist, recognizing him as an immense figure in the country and a man of great ability and force of character. Bevan never reciprocated. When the Minister for Air Production tried to insist that workers stay at their jobs even during air raids, the Minister for Labour threatened to sue his fellow cabinet minister. Churchill always had to work at keeping Beaverbrook on board, as he was continually threatening to resign, and had to soothe Bevin, whose distrust of the newspaper magnate never diminished. But he saw them as the two big beasts of his government. Sir Winston told me several times, his private secretary recalled in 1964, that if Britain had been invaded in 1940 and we had had to fall back north of the Thames, he would have ruled Britain with a triumvirate of himself, Beaverbrook, and Ernest Bevin. The fact is, however, that Beaverbrook proved to be the man for the moment, not for the hour. When the moment passed, when the danger of imminent German invasion lapsed, and when he really could no longer stand the paperwork and committee work any longer, he resigned. Churchill was not done with him, however, and would bring him back into the War Cabinet in a different position later in the war. Then the battles recommenced. All through that summer of 1940, one could practically hear the motors of the German Luftwaffe revving up, the clanking of the panzer divisions, and the tramp of many millions of goose-stepping soldiers just across the English Channel. Should Hitler send them to invade, the British Home Forces had in early June 1940 only 54 two-pounder anti-tank guns, 420 field guns with 200 rounds of ammunition apiece, 613 medium and heavy guns with 150 rounds for each, 105 medium and heavy tanks, 395 light tanks, 2,300 Bren light machine guns, and 70,000 rifles. Taken altogether, it represented a pittance, hardly enough to defend an entire country. At the War Office, the elegant, capable, cautious, newly appointed Anthony Eden had to think hard, he told a journalist, whether he dare move, say, an anti-tank gun from one district to another. Memories of the material left on the beaches of Dunkirk haunted him. He hadn't enough soldiers either, only a single trained and equipped brigade to defend all of Britain. He told Lord Halifax that he needed at least a month to pull things together. If the Germans came sooner, the country would likely fall. Churchill made things more difficult for him with a characteristically romantic and stubborn gesture that was also an egregious mistake. The Dunkirk evacuation successfully completed, he sent 2 divisions of British and Canadian troops back to France to take part in a last-ditch defence. Eden ground his teeth. He wrote to Churchill that in Kent, Sussex and Surrey, which he had just visited, a holding battalion, a battalion of stevedores, the Hythe Musketry School, an infantry training centre, and an officer training corps of the RASC, the Royal Army Service Corps, concerned with logistical matters and not with combat, all form part of the active defence system by night and by day. This audiobook is continued on Disc 4